Hi, my name is Dr. James Bylan, and I am the owner and co-director of the Bylan Clinic.
Hi, my name is Danielle Morales. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and the co-director of the Violin Clinic. And today we're coming together to close out our part three on the series we have been doing on screen use. So over the past couple episodes, we've talked about different components of screen use. So why screens are addictive, how to ground screen use more broadly in family values, how to set up behavioral guidelines for screen use, as well as covering some of the warning signs that kids may need more help and looking for signs of dependency. And today we're going to go into, why kids with neurodiversity are more susceptible, as well as recommended treatments that are done outside of the home. So when you may need more specialized care, what that looks like and what to look for. But before we dive into the new information, I think it would be really helpful if we could go over a review just on the quick recap of signs of dependency. So, James, are you able to kind of refresh our listeners' memory on, signs that kids may need more help than can be provided at home in this area?
Um, yeah, for sure. Now, I can't remember if we talked about this on the previous episodes or not, but currently, like in the United States, we use um, these guidelines for making clinical diagnoses, right? And sort of internet gaming addiction isn't sort of one of the official diagnoses, right? Now it is in other parts of the world, right? They use a different system for sort of categorizing, classifying neurodevelopmental and mental health conditions, where internet gaming addiction, is a clinical diagnosis, right? But that does provide sort of guidance for us in the United States in terms of what are might be some signs of more significant dependency, right? And so, I'm not going to walk through what all of those are, but there's certainly certain aspects of a behavioral addiction, right? That's what this is considered to be, like a behavioral addiction. That you look for if somebody really has, if this is really having a significant, impact on their functioning. But as is the case with any diagnosable condition, a big part of what you're looking at is functional impact, right? So for children and adolescents, for example, which is sort of the population that we work with at the Bioland Clinic. What's the functional impact, right? So what is is there really significant functional impact in schools, for example, right? Is this creating school attendance problems? Is this creating a decline in academic and school performance? Is it affecting sort of activities of daily living, right? So are they not getting sufficient sleep at night? Are they not taking care of their hygiene anymore? Are they not taking care of responsibilities at at home? Is there relational issues, right? Like is it resulting in significant conflict in the home? Verbal and physical aggression, property destruction, things like that. When we're seeing that really significant functional impact, not just at, potentially at school, at home, relationships with the family, relationships with peers, that's usually a sign of, a higher level of need and perhaps need for, for more support for that individual and their family.
Mhm. Okay. And thanks for going over that. And also for the reminder that internet gaming disorder is currently a study under further review for study for inclusion,
Yeah.
potentially as a diagnostic category in the new or upcoming version of the DSM in the United States, but that
Yeah.
other countries are already recognizing this as a diagnosis through the ICD.
It's coming, it's just like, yeah, exactly. It's a condition under further study, right? But that's in part because, for a number of years now, the International Classification of Diseases has identified it as a mental health condition or behavioral addiction.
Yeah, that's good framing. Just to remind, it's a real condition, right? These behaviors and the functional impairments that are associated with excessive tech use are a real condition. So to kind of, then dovetail into the next part of our conversation, as we talked about previously, kids show different resilience to how much tech time they can handle, right? Which is something that complicates blanket recommendations, right? In terms of, oh, if you just keep it under this amount of time, then it's
Yeah.
okay for this age range. And as we had talked about previously, there's individual personality factors and behavioral factors and cognitive factors, right? There's a lot of layers in terms of how much tech time a kid can kind of handle and have as part of their daily routine. But one thing we do know, right, is that kids with neurodiversity are more susceptible to being at risk for developing internet,
Sure.
gaming disorder or excessive, tech use, these addictive behaviors around technology. So,
Yeah.
can you talk through some of the more common disorders like ADHD, autism, depression, anxiety, and why kids who have these conditions are more susceptible to adverse impacts of screen time?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important thing to consider because you're right. Not every kid responds to screens in the exact same way, right? And to be clear too, just because a child sort of seems more prone to compulsive use or has stronger behavioral reactions to excessive screen use. That also doesn't necessarily mean they've got like a neurodevelopmental disorder, right? But all this exists along a continuum, and certainly I think what I've seen professionally, but also what seems to be supported in the research are kids with um, some common neurodevelopmental disabilities or social emotional needs tend to be more susceptible to the sort of problem recreational screen use, and then also maybe affected by it differently too, right? Like, so, for example, with some of these different neurodevelopmental conditions or social emotional conditions, where they may be more prone to use, but the use also seems to exacerbate their symptom presentation too, right? So kind of a double-edged sword that they're more prone to problem use, and then that problem use leads to more challenges associated with that neurodevelopmental or social emotional condition, right? So some really common ones. One, being ADHD, seems to be, I think, an experience that I've had, as a psychologist and neuropsychologist in diagnosing ADHD is, perhaps parents saying like, hey, I don't think they've got a hard time focusing. They can focus on their video game for hours and hours and hours. They seem to be able to kind of hyper focus, so it couldn't possibly be ADHD. The fact is, though, is ADHD isn't an inability to focus our attention. It's difficulty regulating our attention. So then it's hard to regulate our attention towards things that are not inherently interesting or particularly stimulating, right? But if we have ADHD, we can really engage quite well in activities that are highly stimulating. We tend to be drawn towards activities that are highly stimulating. And the reason for that is those stimulating activities sort of activate the sort of dopamine centers of our brain, and flood our brain with dopamine, that allows us then to be able to focus our attention. And video games are very much that way. They're highly dopaminergic, right? So they stimulate these dopamine centers of our brain, allowing somebody with ADHD to be able to focus their attention and probably feel very regulated, while they're playing those video games. And so their brain tends to sort of crave those activities that are stimulating those dopamine centers of their brain. And video games are about as dopamine. They're not the most dopaminergic activities, but they're very much near the top of the list. I think other, conditions that we see this with, tend to see a lot of kids and adolescents on the autism spectrum be very drawn towards video games, and I think there's pros and cons to these things too. Pros and cons with ADHD also, but certainly some very real pros and cons for kids with autism. In that for many of them, it's a very predictable environment. It's a lot easier for them to be able to navigate socially. That there's fewer of these sort of subtle social cues that they may struggle to pick up on in face-to-face interactions, when they're engaging online. Uh, Oftentimes finding games online that they are very successful at. In the sort of the quote unquote kind of real world, right? In school, may feel sort of isolated and may sort of feel like they're sort of on the fringe socially. But they enter in these online environments where one, they navigate them much more successfully, and probably in many cases demonstrate a very high level of skill, in the game, which gives them a lot of social clout. And can kind of move from somebody that's sort of on the fringes socially to somebody who's really admired and praised, in these environments. And for a lot of kids on the autism spectrum, they may even report like, hey, this is the place where I have friends. I don't have friends in other environments, and can in many ways be a very positive, environment for kids on the spectrum. I think the challenge, whether it's ADHD or autism or maybe like social anxiety or depression or things like that too, that we tend to see sort of more problematic screen use is there are pros and cons. So while it might provide a more predictable environment where somebody can be more successful socially, too much of a good thing can be bad, right? And what we see too is diminishing of social skills in face-to-face interactions because they're not having as many opportunities to practice and develop those skills also, right? So again, some pros and cons there, but autism being another one where we tend to see a high level of recreational screen use and sometimes tipping into problematic recreational screen use as well.
Mhm, mhm. And I know with ADHD and autism too, there can be, again, that bidirectional impact on executive skills and executive functioning.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, kind of going back to the idea of ADHD, right? So, a lot of these games or activities they're engaged in online are very highly stimulating, right? So they are able to lock their attention in and sustain it for long periods of time too. But what we also see is the more time that they're spending online, the harder it is for them to then be able to regulate their attention in environments that aren't as stimulating, right? So the rest of the world becomes very slow and boring. It was probably pretty slow and boring for them already, and now that's even worse now because of the amount of time that they're spending online. And then sort of these executive skills, right? Sort of then follow, right? So my ability to sort of manage multiple pieces of information to be able to complete tasks, or my ability to plan ahead and to stay organized and to sort of self-monitor my performance, are all things that are then impacted as well too. And that's something that we see both with kids with ADHD, but also with autism. I mean, a significant number of individuals with autism have co-occurring ADHD, and even when they don't, often struggle with many aspects of executive functioning already.
Mhm, mhm. And that bidirectionality can also come into play with social skills too, right? So if you're not
Yeah,
practicing social skills in vivo, right? You're not watching somebody's eye contact and the integration of their verbals with their nonverbals. You're used to just attending to maybe just hearing a voice, and you're getting less and less exposure and practice to having those interactions. Those skills degrade, whether or not you have neurodiversity or not, right?
exactly, for
People,
sure.
that was a huge thing coming out of the pandemic, still is, that people lost a lot of social skills in the process.
Yeah, we see that a lot with just neurotypical kids now in terms of eye contact. Have a much harder time, making and sustaining and regulating appropriate eye contact in conversation. And it seems to be just uh, I don't know if causal, but certainly correlates with the amount of time that they're spending interacting with people online and not interacting face to faces. We do see a sort of a decline in social skills, and if you have autism and certainly core to that disorder is impairments in social communication, including eye contact, picking up on nonverbal communication, kind of perceiving what other people might be thinking or feeling. Those skills. Are oftentimes things we're working on developing and improving, and the more time that they're spending online, oftentimes we see a decline in those skills.
Mhm, mhm. I think we covered the neurodevelopmental disabilities, or two of the more common ones that we see in our practice as educational psychologists with ADHD and autism. For the psychological disorders like anxiety and depression, right? Somebody who is experiencing low motivation, they may not be up to leaving the house, is going to be more drawn to, sitting on the sofa playing video games, watching Netflix, or just interacting maybe over social media, for example. And social anxiety often couples with autism, right? Because again, that's inherent with that disorder, is trouble interpreting social cues and whatnot, as we've spoken about. But social anxiety can also exist on its own. And so somebody can be a kid can be very nervous about having to again keep a conversation going, or not having the luxury of an indefinite pause when responding to a text message, right? To think about what they're going to reply and say next. So there's a lot of areas where tech can pull on the more psychological facing conditions as well.
Yeah, for sure. And similar to what we see with the neurodevelopmental disabilities too. I mean, there's some ways, like the example you gave with text messaging, where it may really help and kind of facilitate, social interaction. But again, the more time people are spending online and young people are spending online, the higher levels of social anxiety we tend to see, the higher levels of depression. And so, while again these sort of pros and cons, while it might serve to benefit kids. I think sort of finding and striking that balance between the amount of time they're engaging with others online, whether it's through video games or social media. What's the amount that they can reasonably be able to do that without it having that functional impact, that we started off, talking about, where where we're not seeing major problem behaviors at home, verbal and physical aggression, where we're not seeing major disturbances in sleep and school performance and daily living skills, and trying to strike that balance where we can get the benefits of tech use perhaps, for some of these kids, without it slipping into a space where, again, worsening of attention and executive skills, worsening of social skills, worsening of depressive symptoms, and so forth.
Mhm, mhm. And I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind as we pivot to the next part of our conversation, right? Which is around what treatment looks like.
Yeah,
So again, when we are seeing that high degree of functional impairment in one or more areas where you are starting to get very concerned about functioning. So I know that we covered what we would call tier one, right, which is the more routine approach to these things in household settings in our last episode. But perhaps you can give a recap of kind of high level, tier one places to start,
yeah.
and then we can move into, again, that seeing the signs that that's not effective. We need a higher level of care. What that stratification looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So just a like brief recap, from our previous conversation, and I think I was thinking about this the last time we had the conversation. I'm thinking about it again now. So I mean, we could really dedicate a whole episode to just sort of this kind of tier one, as you described it, intervention, and what all of us as parents and can be doing to support our kids and navigating this new world, that we're all living in. But really, sort of this tier one kind of this idea of like what everybody really should be doing, is really stopping as parents to reflect on and frankly having conversations with our kids, really around what our family values are, and then sort of then talking about how do we live out those values in our behaviors, right? Like what is it? If our value is open face to face communication, right? Then what does that actually look like, say at the dinner table, and then of course beyond that, how does tech fit into it, right? Or if we value our education, right? Behaviorally, what does that look like? Well, it looks like coming home and doing our homework, first thing when we get home, and it means studying for tests, and it means getting enough sleep before we go to school the next day, so our brains functioning optimally, right? And then beyond that, okay, now how does tech fit into that, right? Like how does tech fit into our behavior of getting our homework done first thing when we get home, right? Same thing for we value good sleep and good nutrition. We value time outdoors. We value physical movement and activity. We value all the social benefits of participating in sports. So and then again, you figure out then now how does tech fit into that? And for most, well, for all of us really, right? Like if we're doing all of those other things, it really does squeeze out a lot of extra time for tech use. And what it does leave behind is probably about the right amount of time, right? Which is the American Academy of Pediatrics not having really firm recommendations around the amount of time, but saying like, hey, we need to do all of these other things, and then if there's a little bit of time left over at the day, maybe it's a half hour one day, maybe it's 2 hours another day, right? But if we're doing all of these other things, then sure, some recreational tech time can fit into that. So that's that idea of like sort of tier one, is to say like, okay, what do we value as a family? What behaviors show that those are our values, right? And then how does tech use fit into that? And I suppose sort of still tier one, for some of our kids, we might need to have more sort of clear sort of behavioral uh, guideline or boundaries, for their tech use, right? And so for maybe some of our kids, we really need to be very explicit about it, right? Like, no, we get 1 hour a day of recreational tech time, for example, or maybe having really clear guidelines in terms of what does it mean if we violate that, right? So we had we're not allowed to have devices in our bedroom, and we find out that they're sneaking devices into their bedroom. Like, what are the behavioral consequences for that? I mean, that's sort of an extension of this also, too, right? Like, what are our expectations around behavior in the home, and what are the rewards and consequences for those behaviors?
Mhm, mhm. Mhm. And so again, as we said, like making sure we have the basics and the foundation laid, can be really important when we're monitoring for, all right, when is a behavior or a need above and beyond that, right? Because sometimes I know in working with clients, there'll be a high degree of anxiety around tech use, as many parents have, understandably, but we haven't laid some of that basic groundwork. And that's also not to say that you know parents shouldn't seek professional guidance if they need help in clarifying their
Yeah.
values, right? Because sometimes that's something that can be done in therapy too, right? Is
Yeah.
somebody can actually sit down with the family and make that explicit. There's a whole process called like a acceptance and commitment therapy matrix that you can complete. We won't get in the weeds on it, but there's things you can do. You can get professional help if you do still feel like you need help with that step one, and that's perfectly okay. And you can find providers to help clarify values and set up those
Yeah.
basic foundations.
Yeah.
And a lot of families are going to be comfortable doing that process by themselves. But
Yeah.
when we get to the next step, right, where we do, maybe we've tried these things, and we're seeing a lot of deceptive behaviors, a lot of lying, staying up late, sneaking around, or we're still just getting into constant arguments, or the grades are still suffering. What does it look like when you do involve a therapist in kind of a higher level of care as part of the next step?
Yeah, for sure. And just to kind of reiterate what you were just saying first too. I mean, it certainly if there's a lot of deception around use, right? If we cannot trust our kids to be able to comply with the kind of behavioral standards that we've set as a family, I mean that in addition to sort of the functional impact, right? I mean, those are certainly things that we might say, okay, we need some help, with this, right? Because we've kind of gone to the extent that we can as parents, and we're still seeing the problematic use. But sort of what you were saying too, just around healthy communication. We can see some real communication issues and breakdowns around tech use these days with kids too. Sort of on the kind of more extreme end of things, right? A lot of verbal and physical aggression, even, right? But even just having a therapist to help kind of facilitate that healthy communication and teaching us as parents how to more effectively communicate with our kids too, in addition to helping our kids learn how to more effectively communicate their thoughts and feelings as well. May be helpful even at a lower level, right? But when we're looking at treatment, it's gonna look different, from kid to kid. I just wanna be real clear and upfront about that too. I mean, we can kind of make general statements, right, in terms of what are some components of what that treatment might look like. But there's obviously a lot of individual tailoring, that the therapist is gonna, need to do for each individual kid and circumstance, right? I mean, we've talked about, some of the different, sort of neurodevelopmental disorders that might be layered on top of this, right? Like, is part of the problematic tech use related to poor impulse control and ADHD? Is it related to autism and social skills or social anxiety or depression? I mean, there's so many different individual aspects of this. In addition to environmental factors, family dynamics that are all going to have to be considered. But there certainly are some things that are probably pretty common, amongst people who are treating, problematic tech use. Certainly one of them is just around, what they call like psychoeducation, right? So, helping, the individual understand, their own use and the impact of it, helping the family understand, what the impact of it is. And, part of that is teaching, but a lot of that is sort of assessment too, right? Like actual gathering real data in terms of, how much time is somebody engaged in, with recreational screen devices. What are the activities they tend to lean towards? What kind of seems to trigger their use? The amount of time, of course, that they're spending on it. What are some of the functional and behavioral impacts, of their tech use? And gathering a lot of that data up front can be really helpful in kind of bringing awareness to the severity, perhaps, of the issue, but also gives us real clear baseline data too, because we can then use that to then measure progress, right? So now we say, okay, we're using it X amount of time, engaged in this activity, it leads to this behavior. What would progress look like? What, if we're starting to make progress, what would be some signs of that, right? And again, so we can measure it against that baseline, because it might not mean like complete abstinence, right? But maybe we're seeing a decline in terms of the amount of times they're going on the device, decline in the amount of time they're on the device, a decline in the behaviors that result from them spending time on the device. So that psychoeducation piece is uh, really important. And then again, there's going to be other components that may be more tailored to the individual, right? So A lot of times when we're any kind of behavioral addiction or sort of compulsive behaviors, there's this sort of a distress that somebody experiences that sort of drives them to engage in the behavior. And so learning how to sort of ride the wave of that distress, for example, and being able to sit with it long enough for that distress to sort of naturally taper off, and not have as much control over our behavior is maybe an important part of the treatment. Learning to identify triggers in our environments, learning to identify sort of maladaptive thinking that sort of drives us towards that behavior, and looking at ways to sort of reframe our thinking or be able to find behaviors that we engage in instead of the problem tech use. So, and then of course there's all the individual components around, do I need work on, social skills and social communication, right? Is there this underlying depression that really needs to be treated as well? Is there, the social anxiety component that needs to be treated? Are there aspects of my ADHD that are going untreated that may be contributing to my problem tech use? So it can become very, individualized. And then beyond that, what I would say too is, unlike any other addiction, probably, most addictions, part of the treatment long term is not putting myself in an environment where I'm going to be triggered, right? So, if I'm um, trying to, combat alcohol addiction, for example, right? Well, I don't walk down the aisle at my grocery store where they have the beer, wine, and hard liquor, right? I avoid that aisle, right? Because it could be potentially triggering. I don't go into bars, right? Like maybe I avoid certain, social activities where there's going to be, drinking. But with tech, you can't do that, right? Because we live in an environment where we're pretty immersed in technology, right? So part of the treatment then too is, how do we plan for times when we slip up? How do we create an environment around ourselves where we lessen the number of triggers, right? So now we're sort of thinking about long-term planning and how do I now live my life in a world where, there's going to be a lot of triggers for problem tech use, and how do I manage that, and how do I pick myself up when I fall?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and also, those triggers and environmental pieces that are outside of the parent and home immediate control, right?
Yeah.
A lot of schools now issue a Chromebook to kids, for example.
Yeah.
So if you have kids who have compulsive tech use or recovering from, tech addiction, there's a lot of triggers and a lot of parties to kind of account for in the
Yeah.
treatment
Yeah,
process.
for sure. Working with schools for sure, because I've definitely seen that too, where the tech use is really well controlled at home, and then they go into school, and even when they're not issued a Chromebook and they look around and everyone in the classroom is, it can be really triggering and lead to some really significant behaviors. Um, so certainly something to keep in mind. I'm waiting for the study that comes out that shows us, how one-to-one devices in the classroom have improved learning. Because anecdotally, what I see in the classroom and what I hear from teachers even is it's been more of a disruption to learning than anything else. From the amount of time it takes to log onto the device, to the kids multitasking and going onto websites they're not supposed to be going on. I haven't heard anecdotally how it's actually improved learning the way that it was presented 10 years ago.
Mhm, mhm, such a good point. Yeah. So to recap, we're kind of moving into tier two, right? It's going to be really individualized based on obviously the presenting concerns, but common themes are going to be, looking at getting an assessment of, degree of impact, degree of need, um, goals, right? And the goals are going to vary family by family. Some families may say, hey, like as long as your grades are above X amount, like that's the main pain point, or I don't care how much time in hours you're spending, but I need you to make sure you're doing your chores, or, not snapping at your mom or dad, right? Like there, so it's gonna vary. And then the common components being psychoeducation and leaning into whatever treatment modality is most appropriate, right, based on the therapist discretion. And from there, also remediating skill deficits if it's a lack of coping skills that's driving the behavior, or a lack of social skills, for example, that's driving the behavior, like trying to address it from those different angles. And that's very successful for a lot of families too, right? So kind of going more intensive step by step. What are signs when there's a higher level of need even beyond that, right? So maybe there is already a therapist involved, but you're seeing signs that warrant an even more intensive level of need beyond what can be provided through, weekly talk therapy sessions.
Yeah, it's like on the face of it, you think like, oh, problem, um, recreational screens, they're playing video games too much, they're spending too much time on social media. I mean, we all sort of experienced this to some degree. I think even as adults, there's times where I'm like, okay, like, enough's enough for myself, but it seems kind of low level, I think, but the severity that some children and adolescents and families can experience as a result of this, can't really be overstated. I mean, we have had clients, come through our clinic, who have, histories of, you know, real severe behaviors, very violent behaviors, significant property destruction, real threats to their lives and the lives of their family members, who have really required intensive psychiatric care in order to be able to stabilize uh, their behaviors and address sort of acute stabilization of their mental health needs. And just in more severe cases where individuals are really sort of a threat to their lives or the lives of others, and it needs to be taken very seriously. And I think if there's a point at which a parent believes that their child may be a threat to themselves or others, that it's really important that we do everything we can to ensure that child's safety and the safety of those around them. And that may necessitate, calling 911 and getting psychiatric evaluation to ensure that they're safe and family members are safe and others around them are safe.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think what's good about having this conversation today is really bringing to the forefront that these behaviors that are so alarming to parents, understandably, are unfortunately not uncommon. If you have a kid that is locking themselves in their room, or pretty explosive, or making statements or threats around, threats of self harm, for example, if device access is terminated, that is obviously the more intense level on the continuum of behaviors, but a lot of families are struggling with that. And with any level of need that's reaching that level of intensity, we want to be reaching out to emergency responders, calling 911, getting our kid to the ER, because we want to protect safety first, right? Regardless of if it's originating from excessive tech use or another place, we may need to call in emergency responders. And sometimes, as a result of that, kids are hospitalized and receive residential inpatient care until things are stabilized.
Yeah, for sure. Just important for families to keep in mind, right? That is the uh, rare, but certainly does. It certainly does happen, particularly when kids feel, particularly tied to their devices and feel perhaps even, hopelessness, if they're disconnected from the devices or are particularly prone to sort of impulsive actions. We may see, more of these types of behaviors. So just really important for parents to kind of keep that in mind. Seeking treatment early when we think that treatment is necessary, and being prepared to protect our kids, even if it means short-term, hospitalization.
Mhm, mhm. Okay. Well, anything else that you think is good to note before we round out our conversation today?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. I mean, I know we sort of, hit these things from a pretty high level, but yeah, it would certainly be great to bring somebody on who actually treats, tech addiction to kind of get down into a little bit more detail in terms of what that might look like and the signs they're looking for and what their treatment looks like. But yeah, I think we certainly from a high level covered things today.
Mhm, mhm. All right. Well, thanks for your time today, James. It's good talking with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thanks. Have a good one.